Hello everyone, bonjour à tous. Je m'appelle Joel Heisey et je suis directeur principal approvisionnement et gestion du matériel au secteur de la gestion des investissements du Bureau du Controller General du SCT. Aujourd'hui, j'agirai en tant que modérateur de cette table ronde sur la politique achetée canadienne. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge that I'm joining you from the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people. I'd encourage you to take a moment to reflect on the traditional territory upon which we are working today. I want to start by sharing an idea. Every contract we award is a choice. In the federal government, procurement is often framed as an administrative function, a series of compliance exercises and transactions. But that perspective underestimates the extraordinary responsibility we hold. Public procurement, which represents over $40 billion in annual spending at the federal level, is one of the most strategic economic levers in the country. And every time we use it consciously, we have the opportunity to strengthen the foundation upon which Canada stands. Nous nous réunissons à un moment décisif. Pendant des décennies, l'environnement commercial mondial était prévisible et nos stratégies ont suivi le mouvement en nous concentrant sur le prix le plus bas et la livraison le plus rapide. But the world has changed, and today we face a landscape that is increasingly divided and more volatile. And last September, the Prime Minister sent a very clear message to Canadians and to public servants. Canada will no longer be a bystander to these global shifts. Avec le lancement du cadre stratégique de la politique d'approvisionnement acheté canadien, nous sommes passés d'une attitude axée sur les meilleurs efforts à un mandat obligatoire. Ce n'est pas une question d'isolement, c'est une question de souveraineté. Il s'agit de s'assurer que lorsque le Canada achète et construit, il le fait en accordant la priorité absolue aux intérêts canadiens. To the procurement practitioners in this room, I want to be very clear about your role. In this new era, you're not just administrators of contracts. You're, in a very real sense, promoters of Canada's economic resilience and defenders of our sovereignty. Chaque décision que vous prenez dans le cadre de l'élaboration d'une stratégie d'approvisionnement est une occasion de renforcer nos industries et de faire en sorte que nos concitoyens canadiens conservent leur emploi. Soyez confiants et fiers de savoir que votre expertise est un élément essentiel du moteur de cette transition. We know the road ahead isn't without its challenges. The policy requirements represent a massive shift in the way that we work. It requires new skills, new methodologies, and a new way of thinking about best value. C'est exactement la raison pour laquelle nous sommes ici aujourd'hui. Nous ne sommes pas ici pour simplement lire le texte de la politique. Nous sommes ici pour discuter comment donner à nos innovateurs locaux les moyens d'être plus compétitifs sur la scène mondiale. Comment pouvons-nous naviguer dans ces complexités sans sacrifier l'efficacité? Et comment pouvons-nous nous assurer que les investissements publics que nous gérons rendent le Canada plus fort aujourd'hui et aussi à l'avenir? I'm honored to be joined by a panel of leaders who are navigating these exact questions. They're here to share with you their experiences to date, to offer you their lessons learned that can help in your application of the policy. So the first half of our session will be a panel discussion, and the second half will be an opportunity for you to ask our panelists questions. And with that, I'd like to get started. So I will ask the panelists to first take a few minutes to introduce themselves and their roles. Ron, can I start with you, please?
Sure. Thanks, Joel. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Ron Cormier. I work at Public Services and Procurement Canada. In my role at PSPC, I'm a Director General, and I oversee procurement of IMIT, research and development, and professional services contracting on behalf of departments across government as a common service provider. And I'm looking forward to today's discussions. Thanks.
Merci, Ron. Barb, over to you.
Hi, everyone. My name is Barbara Gibbon. I'm the Director General for Innovative Solutions Canada at Innovation, Science and Economic Development. Innovative Solutions Canada is essentially a Buy Canadian program. It's a government-wide innovation program that connects federal departments to Canadian companies to help support the development, testing, and procurement of Canadian-made technologies. We run the program to help both let departments uh, get access to Canadian technologies that they might not be aware of otherwise, but also to accelerate the adoption and increase domestic procurement opportunities and strengthen Canada's industrial and technological base.
Thanks, Barb. Pat, à vous.
Oui, merci Joël. Bonjour, bon après-midi à toutes et à tous. Je suis Patrick Comtois, directeur général pour les achats d'entreprises en technologie de l'information à Services partagés Canada. Premièrement, je dois dire, ça me fait vraiment plaisir d'être ici pour participer avec mes collègues à une discussion sur un sujet très important pour supporter le développement économique du Canada. And maybe just quickly, for those of you that may be a little bit less familiar with Shared Services Canada, at a very high level, we're responsible to deliver the information technology services for the government of Canada. Think about things you use on a daily basis, like microcomputer, and things like hosting services such as data center or cloud services, networking solution, telecommunication like satellite, and things that support employees' productivity directly, like the 365 suite as an example. So like PSPC, we are a common service provider, but we're focused on the delivery of IT services, including the procurement to enable the delivery of these services. Donc, mon focus aujourd'hui, si je peux dire, sera donc plus axé sur l'impact de la nouvelle politique acheter canadien sur l'acquisition des services de technologie de l'information. Donc, encore une fois, très heureux d'être ici, puis j'ai très hâte d'entamer les discussions.
Merci, Pat. And finally, Scott, over to you, sir.
Yeah, hi. I'm Scott Levac. I'm the Director of Technology Strategies within the Office of the Chief Information Officer at Treasury Board Secretariat. We're primarily a policy shop. I think the main reason that I'm included in this panel is I was part of a team that published a paper on the topic of digital sovereignty a few months ago. And we see a certain amount of overlap between this topic around Buy Canada, but also digital sovereignty. So I think that's my main purpose here, is to talk a little bit about how we view digital sovereignty in the context of this new policy.
Perfect. Thank you, Scott. And with that, we'll start our panel discussion. So we've organized the discussion today sort of into rough themes. We'll start with theme one, setting the foundation. So this is about trying to just sort of clarify what the policy is for those of you who might not have a strong appreciation of it. Ron, I'm going to start with a question for you, if you don't mind. To kick us off, can you give us a high-level overview of Buy Canadian objectives, what this new framework covers, and how the policies are applied? And as a corollary, when do the policies not apply?
Great. Yeah, thanks for the question, Joel. So I think you provided some excellent context in the intro remarks. I won't dwell on it a whole lot other than to say federal spending on goods, services, and construction at this point is averaging a little over $50 billion a year. And Canada as a country has become highly reliant on exports. It's a disproportionate reliance compared to the open import market that we effectively have as our trading position up to this point, and it's particularly vulnerable as a result. So in response to the changing global landscape, and we're all quite familiar with it, back in September, the PM announced the Buy Canadian policy. It's part of a suite of comprehensive measures to protect, build, and transform Canadian strategic industries. So when we look at objectives at a high level, fundamentally, the suite of policies is designed to strengthen Canada's economic resilience and leverage federal procurement to support domestic industry and workers. The policy approach isn't one policy. It's really made up of three principal policies. There's the that are currently available, I should say. So there's the policy on prioritizing Canadian materials, which at a high level is about requiring the use of Canadian produced steel, aluminum, and wood in certain defense and construction projects. It's another policy is the policy on prioritizing Canadian suppliers and Canadian content, and that's designed to favor Canadian businesses and incentivize the use of Canadian content in the delivery of goods and services. And then there's the policy on reciprocal procurement, which is limiting participations from countries that don't offer similar access to their markets that Canada offers to its market. There's also a fourth policy that's in the works, and be a little premature to talk in great detail about it today. But there's a policy on small business procurement that we anticipate to come out a little later in 2026. So in terms of specifics, the suite of policies largely prioritizes Canadian suppliers and content and strategic procurements. So you might say, well, what is a strategic procurement in this case? Well, right now that means a procurement over $25 million. But beginning in June, I think the date is June 15th, that $25 million figure will drop to $5 million as the threshold for the application of the policies and related measures. And it relates specifically to strategic commodities that are listed in the policy suite. I'll list those very quickly. There's defense and security, information and communication technology, infrastructure, construction and transportation, health and pharmaceuticals, and consumer and industrial goods and materials. It also impacts any of the professional services that are directly supporting those specific strategic commodity areas. So departments and agencies are going to be strongly encouraged to apply these requirements to excluded procurements wherever feasible as well, even below applicable thresholds to support domestic industry. It also formalizes the prioritization of Canadian suppliers and content through point-rated criteria or price-based mechanisms in the bid evaluation process. I'll talk a little bit more about that later. There's a mandatory use of Canadian produced materials, steel, wood, and aluminum in large construction and defense projects with supplier certification and record keeping obligations that come along with that. And eligibility rules limiting participation to Canadian suppliers or from trading partners in accordance with the reciprocal procurement policy. So there's some exclusions in this space. There's always an exclusion. And in this case, procurements that support sensitive operations, so think things like the high security establishments in Canada, supporting missions abroad, and agreements that are entered into with other government entities like foreign military sales, or deliverables that'll be delivered solely outside of Canada. These are areas that are automatically excluded from the policy, and I think that makes sense. There's an exception process as well. It's case by case, and the policy suite makes it clear that this is only to be accessed when it's very strictly necessary. The exception reasons would be a best value, and that would be where the application of the policy would result in a cost increase greater than 25% above market rate. When the procurement isn't in the public interest, where the application of the policy would be inconsistent with that interest. Where there's no capacity or availability. So where the good isn't produced in Canada, it's not available in sufficient or reasonable quantities, the service isn't offered by Canadian companies, that sort of thing. Where it might produce an undue delay. So where the application of the policy measures would result in delays that are critical specifically for defense or national security priorities. Or where something is commercial off the shelf or military off the shelf commodity buying. It should be noted that any exception, if the buyers that are out there on the phone are listening to this, if you want to pursue one, they have to be approved at the minister level at the department or agency that's undertaking the procurement from a requirements perspective, as well as the responsible minister at a common service provider department if there is one. So typically that would be the Minister of PSPC and Shared Services Canada. So maybe I'll leave it there.
Thanks, Ron. That was a great summary, and I think worth stressing that last point about the approval level for exceptions. That is a good indicator of just how important the policy is at the federal level. Like ministerial approval of exceptions is clearly designed to ensure that we're giving a lot of second thought to whether exceptions are required before elevating to that level. The next question I'll pose to Pat. Pat, les gens se demandent probablement si ce qu'on entend par fournisseur canadien. Quelle définition y donnons-nous et comment cette définition s'applique-t-elle dans le secteur de l'approvisionnement en TI?
Oui, merci Joël. Excellente question. Je pense que c'est la base de comprendre un peu la définition de la politique pour pouvoir l'appliquer, la définition des fournisseurs. Fait que je vais peut-être vous donner la définition formelle qu'on retrouve dans la politique, puis je vais vous donner après ça des exemples. Je vais ramener ça au domaine de la technologie d'information. Vous allez pouvoir probablement faire la relation avec les commodités dans lesquelles ou le secteur dans lequel vous travaillez. Donc, la politique, Ron a mentionné qu'il y avait un cadre qui définissait certaines politiques. La politique qui définit ce qui est un fournisseur canadien, c'est la politique sur la priorisation des fournisseurs et du contenu canadien dans les approvisionnements. Puis, il y a quatre éléments principaux, si je dirais, là, qui définissent la politique. Premièrement, ça doit être un fournisseur ou une entreprise qui a un établissement au Canada qui est clairement désigné par un nom, puis qui est accessible pendant les heures normales de travail, puis à partir duquel ce fournisseur-là effectue ses activités de façon permanente. Ça doit être aussi un fournisseur qui est enregistré aux fins des déclarations d'impôts, donc un fournisseur qui paye ses taxes au Canada, qui maintient ses activités au Canada puis qui emploie du personnel ici dans le pays au Canada. Puis, un autre élément important, c'est un fournisseur qui ne propose pas de confier en sous-traitance les travaux prévus au contrat d'une manière à ce que ça réduise au minimum les activités à valeur ajoutée exécutées au Canada. Donc, ce que ça veut dire en gros, ça serait un fournisseur qui est pas seulement une façade, mais qui exécute vraiment ses activités au Canada puis qui emploie des gens ici localement. Un autre dernier élément, peut-être avant de passer aux exemples, la politique nous dit aussi qu'afin de déterminer si un fournisseur canadien, l'autorité contractante peut tenir compte de la nature de l'industrie, du secteur puis de l'emplacement géographique du fournisseur. Donc, ça va être une nuance importante qu'on va devoir évaluer à travers les différents processus d'acquisition, comment on applique ça dans la politique. Comme vous voyez, la définition établit pas un fournisseur canadien comme étant un fournisseur qui est nécessairement d'une propriété purement canadienne ou qui est sous contrôle d'une entité purement canadienne. Ce qu'on appellerait là, chez nous une compagnie sirop d'érable, si je peux dire. Donc, pour être, par exemple, une filiale d'une compagnie étrangère qui est bien établie au Canada, puis c'est un élément important pour nous en technologie de l'information parce que on a beaucoup de gaps. On travaille beaucoup avec les filières étrangères présentement qui sont établies au Canada pour adresser nos besoins en technologie de l'information. Donc, par exemple, en info nuagique, en réseau, dans les différents domaines que j'ai mentionnés là, dans ma présentation. Puis souvent, ces filières étrangères-là vont amener de la valeur ajoutée. On fait des investissements au Canada. Donc, la politique ne voulait pas éliminer ou désavantager nécessairement ce type de compagnie-là, mais on voulait lui donner des incentives à venir amener plus de valeur encore au Canada. Donc, peut-être justement pour illustrer là, concrètement la définition, je donnerais peut-être 4 types de différents fournisseurs avec qui on fait affaire dans le domaine de la technologie de l'information. J'ai parlé de compagnies étrangères qui ont une filiale canadienne. Il y en a aussi en technologie de l'information. On fait affaire avec certaines compagnies étrangères ou fournisseurs étrangers qui n'ont aucune présence au Canada. Donc, c'est une réalité, il y a certaines capacités qu'on n'a pas, puis on doit faire affaire quand même avec ces compagnies-là. Donc, eux seraient désavantagés par notre politique parce qu'ils ne seraient pas définis comme une compagnie canadienne. Donc, on va les motiver à venir justement faire des investissements au Canada, puis amener de la valeur. Deuxième type de compagnie, c'est ce que j'ai mentionné, une compagnie étrangère avec une filiale canadienne qui crée de l'emploi, qui crée de la valeur. Puis, ces compagnies-là, on veut les stimuler à venir en faire plus chez nous, puis c'est ce que la politique va nous permettre de faire. Troisième type de compagnie avec qui on fait affaire, c'est ce qu'on appellerait des revendeurs ou des intégrateurs qui sont, eux, sur le contrôle canadien, qui sont de propriété canadienne, puis qui travaillent souvent justement avec des fournisseurs de compagnies étrangères. Il y en a qui amènent beaucoup de valeur ajoutée. Donc, ils vont faire, par exemple, de la formation, de l'installation au Canada, de la configuration de différents types. Puis, il y en a d'autres qui sont seulement des revendeurs. Donc, ce qu'on veut faire avec la politique peut nous servir justement pour ajouter de la valeur à ces fournisseurs, à ces intégrateurs-là. Puis, le dernier type de vendeur avec qui on fait affaire en technologie de l'information, c'est des compagnies canadiennes qui sont sous contrôle canadien, qui sont sous propriété canadienne, puis qui ont des capacités locales. On a des excellentes compagnies au Canada qui designent et qui fabriquent, par exemple, des serveurs. On n'en a pas beaucoup. Même chose dans le domaine infonuagique. Donc, ce qu'on veut faire en support à la politique, c'est justement de donner des incentives, de stimuler le développement de ces compagnies-là pour en faire plus pour nous, puis possiblement exporter pour amener encore plus de valeur. Donc, comment on va implémenter la politique va être clé à permettre à ces 4 différents types d'entrepreneurs, de fournisseurs, d'augmenter leur capacité à venir nous aider à apporter de la valeur, à créer des emplois au Canada. Donc, j'espère que ça vous a aidé. Puis, encore une fois, là, vous devriez être capable de faire un lien entre le type de compagnie avec qui on travaille dans le domaine de la technologie, puis vos différents secteurs d'opération. Donc, je vais arrêter ici, Joël.
Merci, Pat. Nous apprécions la clarté de la définition. De toute évidence, et il n'est pas toujours simple d'identifier une fournisseur canadien. OK. Next question. Scott. Scott, qu'est-ce que la souveraineté numérique et comment la définition de fournisseur canadien appuie-t-elle ce concept?
Okay, merci pour la question. Pour commencer, je pense que c'est important de souligner qu'il existe plusieurs définitions de la souveraineté numérique. On voit que les fournisseurs ou les entreprises ont leur propre définition. Beaucoup de temps, ils utilisent une définition qui promouvoit leurs propres produits. Dans les médias, on voit des autres définitions et même autour du monde, les différents gouvernements ont leur propre définition. Donc, c'est pourquoi nous avons créé notre propre définition pour la souveraineté numérique et tu peux le trouver dans notre papier qui est publié en ligne. Mais je pense que la chose qui est plus importante, c'est les objectifs que nous avons établis pour la souveraineté numérique. Le premier, c'est la protection des données. Donc, ça, c'est important. Il existe déjà, mais je pense que c'est peut-être un peu plus important dans le cadre de la souveraineté numérique. Le deuxième, c'est de maintenir l'offre de biens et des services. On ne veut pas une interruption de ces biens et des services. C'est important pour nous d'assurer l'approvisionnement de toutes ces technologies. Et dernièrement, peut-être le plus important pour cette discussion, c'est d'avoir les avantages économiques pour le Canada. C'est évident que le gouvernement dépense beaucoup d'argent sur la technologie et on veut que ces dépenses reviennent comme les avantages économiques pour le Canada. Donc, pour répondre à ta question, je trouve que la définition de fournisseur canadien s'aligne bien avec le troisième bout, le troisième objectif, c'était d'avoir des avantages économiques pour le Canada. Comme c'était déjà dit, ça exige que les fournisseurs ont une présence au Canada, qu'ils ont des effectifs au Canada, qu'ils font les investissements en Canada. Donc, ça appuie très bien cet objectif. Parallèlement, cette définition ne porte pas sur la propriété ou la citoyenneté des effectifs. Et je pense que ça, c'est important aussi parce que nous voulons l'accès à la marché global de technologie. Beaucoup de technologies viennent autour du monde, donc c'est important que nous maintenions accès à ce marché. Et aussi, ça cause des investissements au Canada. Donc, en conclusion, je trouve que la définition de fournisseur canadien est bien alignée à notre troisième but pour la souveraineté, qui est les avantages économiques pour le Canada. C'est là.
Merci, Scott. J'ai des questions et j'imagine que nos participants en auront aussi. So we'll get to those when we get to the second part of our panel discussion. That was theme one. We're going to move now quickly to theme two, which is about operationalizing the policy. I'm sorry. So more of the implementation aspects or considerations. Ron, I'm going to start with you again, if that's all right. Evaluation is where the rubber hits the road when it comes to implementation of policies within of this policy within the procurement realm. What does Canadian content entail when a bid is being scored? And for non-specialist procurement officers who might be listening in, how do they distinguish between a middleman vendor and a true Canadian value-added bid?
Yeah, thanks, Joel, for the question. I think it merits a little bit of attention. So, on the first part on what does Canadian content entail? So, Canadian content in the sense of the policy refers to tangible, measurable domestic economic value that's embedded in a supplier's bid. And it goes well beyond the supplier's mailing address. So for goods, bids earn points when they're manufactured or processed in Canada, not simply resold by a Canadian distributor. And for services, Canadian content includes the proportion of labor, overhead, and services that are performed in Canada. That includes things like any research and development that's done in Canada by people living in Canada, any engineering support or development that goes into a product, design, customization, the creation of new intellectual property, or integration work that occurs within Canada. So the way this is going to be checked is attestation forms will have to be completed by an offerer, in this case, a bidder that is bidding on a particular piece of work, as part of the submission process, the bid submission process, I should say. One is to confirm eligibility as a Canadian supplier, which is one aspect of how Canadian suppliers can be advantaged in the revised bid evaluation process. And another is to confirm the total Canadian content or value added. So essentially, when you're looking at bid evaluations, both of those things can apply to the same procurement. So your eligibility as a Canadian supplier can be valued at up to 10%, that you meet the definition of Canadian vendor, as Pat kind of went through a little earlier. And the content, the percentage of Canadian content that is added to that bid can be up to another 25% of the bid evaluation in total. So in essence, There's a couple of different methodologies that can be chosen for how you evaluate Canadian content, and it's either a percentage of the total score in bid evaluation that's used to determine the best value for money solution, or it can be instead a percentage of the financial portion of that bid evaluation. And there's some nuance to that procurement officers will work through as they kind of sink their teeth into applying this policy in practice. So then you asked about middlemen, and I think that's a good question. So how do we define or identify or distinguish who's a middleman, and contrast that with a real Canadian value-added bid? So in this context, a middleman would be suppliers that would be known for things like importing goods that are already fully manufactured abroad, and then they're only reselling them from a Canadian address. There's really no Canadian participation other than the retail front, where there's minimal or no Canadian labor integration, customization, or after-sales support being provided in Canada by people that reside in Canada. Offers no Canadian research and development, no local production, no intellectual property being developed in Canada. These are all attributes of it might point you to a supplier being a middleman, and act as branch plant operations of foreign firms without meaningful domestic value creation. To contrast that, if we talk about what genuine Canadian value-added bids would showcase, they'd be things like the goods being manufactured, assembled, or significantly processed in Canada, Canadian-based integration, engineering, software development, technical services, even maybe the help desk, meaningful Canadian labor contributing to production or delivery of the good or service, Canadian-owned intellectual property, research and development, innovation work, and that sort of thing being included in the offer. So effectively, the process runs on a trust but verify approach, I would say. So a lot of this is going to be done with supplier certifications, but there's going to be a mechanism, and buyers will be encouraged to periodically check those certifications. So if there's enough of a check and the balance in the system, the consequence, of course, of not meeting it being the loss of work and other kind of vendor performance measures. But it's very much a landscape where a contracting authority can ask companies for evidence of any of this stuff if it's not clear in the bids. It is incumbent upon those suppliers to maintain those records and provide them on demand. And I think if you look at the list and you look at how the bids are presented, there is a fairly clear contrast, I think, between what's a middleman and somebody that is actually a true value-added Canadian supplier. So maybe I'll leave it there for the next question.
Thanks, Ron. That's great. So becoming clearer and clearer to me as folks speak, like for procurement officers, there is a lot of subjectivity in approaching how we classify potential suppliers. So certainly a lot of work that folks have to do to get themselves up to speed there and be able to execute their roles in this new context. Ron, given your role in PSPC and procurement branch, and the fact that most procurements right now that are going to really be impacted by Canadian policy are going to be procurements that are let through PSPC. I'm going to pick on you with a couple of follow-up questions first before we move on to other folks. So firstly, à présent, que sont censés faire les ministères et organismes dans le cadre de la gestion de leur propre processus d'approvisionnement et de la collaboration avec les fournisseurs des services communs?
Oui, merci pour la question, Joel. Les ministères et les organismes sont encouragés à appliquer les exigences de la politique à leur achat, même si leur valeur est inférieure au seuil financier, afin de stimuler l'industrie canadienne. Les ministères peuvent obtenir des conseils sur l'interprétation des politiques auprès de l'équipe des politiques de Buy Canadian ASPAC au besoin. Et pour les achats relevant de l'autorité des fournisseurs des services communs, on s'attend à ce que les ministères communiquent avec SPC et SPAC dès le début. En tant que l'organisation d'achat, vous devrez réfléchir à acheter canadien et cela comprend, par exemple, vérifier si les entreprises canadiennes, y compris les petites et les moyennes, les innovateurs ou les entreprises autochtones, ont des capacités qui peuvent contribuer ou s'il existe des raisons de sécurité ou de chaîne d'approvisionnement qui justifient l'approvisionnement au Canada. Ils peuvent collaborer avec l'autorité contractante pour concevoir l'achat de la matière, élargir l'accès pour les fournisseurs canadiens, par exemple, développer des contrats surdimensionnés, tout en évitant de continuer ou de contourner, je voulais dire, des règles ou de fractionner les marchés. Ils devraient mobiliser l'industrie dès le début. Des demandes de renseignement, des journées d'industrie, par exemple, et communiquer clairement avec l'industrie. Ils devraient aussi collaborer ou élaborer en collaboration, je veux dire, avec l'autorité contractante la méthode d'évaluation permettant de prioriser le contenu canadien. Dans votre énoncé de travaux et votre plan d'évaluation, s'il vous plaît, reconnaissez les avantages canadiens légitimes. Par exemple, le rendement dans les climats froids, la disponibilité de matériaux fabriqués au Canada, les travaux effectués au Canada, etc. Puis lorsque la politique a été appliquée, gérer le contrat pour faire le suivi des résultats tels que l'emploi de Canadiens et Canadiennes, la sous-traitance, les matériaux et l'innovation, en veillant à ce que les exigences du contrat en matière de contenu canadien soient respectées. Ouais, probablement, je vais le laisser là pour l'instant, Joël.
OK, merci. Bon conseil. En deuxième question de suivi pour vous, donc. À quoi s'attendent des propriétaires fonctionnels et des autorités contractantes en vertu de ces nouvelles politiques?
Bonne question. Les propriétaires fonctionnels jouent un rôle essentiel en veillant à ce que l'approvisionnement soit mené avec l'intégrité, transparence et responsabilité. Ils sont chargés d'établir des résultats clairs et de répondre aux besoins des utilisateurs finaux et de collaborer tôt et souvent avec l'autorité contractante. Donc, tout au long de la planification, de la demande de soumission, de l'évaluation de la gestion des contrats et afin de protéger les fonds publics. Donc, les propriétaires d'entreprises doivent planifier tôt et définir clairement les objectifs de l'approvisionnement, les résultats désirés, la façon dont le contrat les achèvera. L'approvisionnement doit être aussi harmonisé avec les priorités du gouvernement, telles que Acheter Canada, et soutenir les principaux objectifs socio-économiques, notamment comme l'accessibilité, l'environnement, la participation des Autochtones, les intérêts économiques plus larges et des affaires de même. Donc, les propriétaires fonctionnels doivent tenir compte des occasions d'appuyer les achats canadiens lors de la planification de leur achat et documenter les décisions. Avant de lancer un appel d'offres, ils devraient travailler avec l'autorité contractante pour analyser le marché, estimer les coûts, élaborer énoncer des travaux et des critères d'évaluation qui sont clairs. Les propriétaires fonctionnels sont responsables d'évaluer les soumissions de manière équitable et transparente en fonction des critères établis. Et une fois que le contrat est attribué, une gestion rigoureuse des contrats est essentielle. Les propriétaires fonctionnels sont responsables de la vérification des produits livrables, le suivi des coûts, la résolution rapide des problèmes de rendement des entrepreneurs et de la consignation des leçons apprises, Il devrait aussi surveiller que les travaux sont exécutés conformément aux exigences reliées au contenu canadien. Par contre, l'autorité contractante a le pouvoir d'approprier de conclure des contrats au nom du gouvernement du Canada. Il peut s'agir d'un spécialiste d'approvisionnement au sein de votre organisation autour du gouvernement ou que ce soit, ou de SPAC pour les achats de plus grande valeur, dépassant les pouvoirs délégués des ministères. En ce qui concerne la politique d'achat canadienne, l'autorité contractante est responsable de déterminer si une politique d'achat canadienne s'applique, par exemple, diriger les activités de mobilisation de l'industrie, élaborer la demande de propositions, inclure les clauses et les modalités, administrer le processus de demande de soumission, répondre aux questions de l'industrie sur l'application de la politique, peut-être obtenir des précisions en ce qui concerne les attestations d'achat canadiennes fournies par les soumissionnaires, assurer que le contrat attribué comprend les modalités appropriées, y compris celles qui se rapportent au contenu canadien. Demander des documents sur l'origine des matériaux et des ressources dans le cadre des attestations de contenu canadien de l'entrepreneur et aussi gérer les problèmes de conformité s'ils vont avoir lieu. Puis je pense que c'est pour la plupart les différences entre les deux. Donc, je te laisse la parole, Joël.
Merci, Ron. And as the owner of the directive on the management of procurement, we at OCG would like to thank you for helping make that distinction clear. And this is a good opportunity for me to, I apologize because I cannot see the chat that's associated with that is going to the participants here, but we do have a number of links that we will drop into the chat, and I will point to one of those. There's a contracting policy notice 2025-7, which will be linked in there, and you'll see in that contracting policy notice that we highlight the changes that we have made to our directive to reflect the respective roles of business owners and contracting authorities when in the context of the Buy Canadian policy. So thank you, Ron. Next question, Pat, I'm going to pose this one to you, sir. While important to support Canadian economic interests, adding Buy Canadian attestations and scoring weights may add a layer of complexity to procurements. Do you foresee this impacting procurement timelines, particularly for critical IT infrastructure? And if so, how might that be managed to mitigate potential delays?
Yeah, thanks, Joel. Not at all. I don't foresee any issues. Obviously, I'm joking. I think Ron and I was listening to Ron in the last few questions and how smooth he was in explaining the policy and make it make it feel very smooth, very clear, and it's really well documented. That said, I think it's important we'll all be honest with ourselves and recognize that implementing new policy always has some impact on complexity and timelines. And I'd suggest maybe 3 elements that we probably want to focus on in terms of learning and how we'll deal with the timeline effect. The first part is probably for all of us, the procurement community, the business owner community is everything around the basic learning. And again, back to how Ron explained this, Joel, you mentioned you're going to put some links. Everybody has access to the policy. So there's going to be a learning curve initially for us to get up to speed on this and be able to use it to apply it as it is described, including, and that part of this there'll be training colleagues from PSPC implementing different type of tools, template, clauses, the elements to the evaluation process, the verification of supplier compliance, and other related formal enablers from the policy. So there's going to be a learning curve there for sure, which could have some impact on timelines. The second piece is also, I'd say, related with the learning, but it's then how we apply the policy based on our respective sector and domain, and learn to use some of the flexibility to our advantage to achieve the objective of the policy, which is to bring more value and increase the value that's brought to the economy, increase the supplier ecosystem within each of our domain, to ensure that we get, at the end of the day, the right goods and services, the good quality at a good price, but ensure, again, we achieve the socioeconomic benefits that we're looking for. It should say the economic benefits. So learning to use the policy basically along the way. And the third element that's really going to be important to consider is our vendor community, our supplier community. We should expect many questions and even challenges from the vendor community for the acquisition subject to the policy application. We should anticipate needing more engagement session with the vendor, more discussion with the suppliers. We should also ensure, especially initially as we learn, bringing our legal advisor and being more diligent on how we apply it. We need to recognize that the supplier community will also need to learn how to work with this policy, and we should expect that not everybody or every supplier will have the same level of comfort and will have the same level of enthusiasm. We've already had engagement with a number of vendors, and many of them are very, very pleased with the policy. Others, not necessarily as much, and lack of understanding. And as we implement and we learn lessons, we will learn, but also industry will learn to work with this. So all of this to say, these elements will follow their course, will get better and faster with time, and get experience at using and having pattern of how we apply the policy. Now, the question, Joelle, you asked also, how will this impact timelines for delivery of goods and services for critical infrastructure? There's probably a timeline concerns if we're not proactive and don't do anything. So planning is going to be critical. So to my colleagues online on the business owner community, we will have to ensure that discussions on new procurement and discussion on renewal happen earlier, and we have sustained engagement on these. On the IT side at Shared Services Canada, we've already started to work on diversifying, so being proactive while we have ongoing contract to support critical infrastructure, to also work on parallel path and diversification. That's going to be important. I think Ron talked about the exception process at the start. It's certainly a consideration to ensure that we maintain our critical infrastructure healthy, but it's not something that we should abuse. And there's a level of complexity with the exception process, and for the right reason. So again, planning and engagement is going to be key. So in a nutshell, will there be a timeline impact? Yes, and more initially, but can we work through this to ensure critical services and goods are not impacted? Absolutely, and it'll be a collaboration effort. So I'll stop here, Joelle, on that question.
Excellent. Thank you, Pat. It'd be interesting hearing potentially when we get to the Q&A period more about what you're hearing from suppliers. Be interesting insight for sure. Barb, last question of this theme to you. How does the Canadian supplier definition align with the existing criteria for Innovative Solutions Canada? And you talked a little bit off the top about what your program was, but if you want to dive into a further explanation, happy to hear it here.
Yeah, for sure. Thanks. So, I mean, as I noted off the top, Innovative Solutions Canada is a Canadian by Canadian program, right? Like it is an innovation program, and it looks to help support Canadian companies. And in fact, some of what Pat was just talking about trying to ensure that we have Canadian suppliers available, is exactly what Innovative Solutions Canada was created to do, right? We have the ability to work with Canadian companies and support them, and primarily SMEs, along their innovation journey from research and development through to testing prototypes, and then to commercializing their innovative solutions. We support the Buy Canadian objectives by working to increase the availability and maturity of Canadian developed solutions so that they can be considered in future procurement processes. And that fits really well with the conversation that we're just having here right now. Since the program launched in 2017, just to give you a little bit of background, we work with both grants and contracts to support development and testing. We've done over 1,400 projects with Canadian companies through the program, valued at over 825 million. And these have supported strategic areas like defense and dual use, quantum, AI, and digitalization. We're also uniquely positioned to support departments in implementing the Buy Canadian policy because we do have this ability to do calls for solutions to help develop the Canadian ecosystem so that where we think we may have a gap in what Canadian companies can address, we can work through Innovative Solutions Canada to help Canadian companies build that capacity over the coming years. Le programme consacre depuis plusieurs années à l'identification d'entreprises canadiennes innovantes, ce qui nous donne une expérience pratique dans la définition et la reconnaissance des fournisseurs canadiens. Under our current intake framework, just building off of the areas that the Pat and Ron have talked about, our program and the way that we have looked at Canadian companies really does align fairly strongly with the new definitions of both Canadian suppliers and then also Canadian content that are being put forward. So we are definitely looking for that part of our application process to continue, and we'll continue to refine and review to ensure alignment as we go forward. We look at both their status as a Canadian offerer, the use of Canadian content, which is really important in innovation, particularly if companies are working with other products and bringing them along an ecosystem. We've seen onshoring of manufacturing here into Canada as a result of the program, where a company wanted to work with another company's technology, and to meet the program's Canadian content requirements, that content had to shift to manufacturing in Canada, for example. And we look at the usual areas of Canadian ownership and presence in Canada. So I think overall we feel that we've got a lot of experience in working in the areas that this policy will be focusing on, and we'll continue to work with our colleagues as all of this moves forward.
Thanks, Barb. That's it for our second theme. We'll move to the third. Before we do, I'll just provide a quick reminder to participants. In the top right part of your screen, you'll see a bubble. You can use that icon to submit questions to the moderator for the Q&A session that's to follow the panel discussion. So if you haven't already been doing that and you have questions that are that you're starting to accumulate, please do feel free to add them, and we'll try to get as many as we can in the second hour of our discussion. On to theme three. So strategic integration, innovation, sovereignty, and SMEs. So continuing on some of the themes that we've already discussed a little bit, but we're going to do a little bit of a deeper dive. Scott, I'm going to pose the first question to you, sir. OCIO recently published a white paper on digital sovereignty, which you had mentioned earlier. How do these procurement policies support the goal of owning the tools and the rules? Specifically, does the new definition of Canadian supplier help Canada maintain autonomy over its data and infrastructure? So that's data sovereignty has been an issue for quite
Mhm.
some time, but we've kind of getting a new angle on it here with by Canada. Over to you.
Yeah, thanks for the question. I think, to build a bit on my previous answer, when we looked at, again, digital sovereignty, we established three outcomes: protection of data, maintaining supply to those goods and services, and the economic benefits that Canada gets. And so I think, again, the definition of Canadian supplier does a great job for that third goal of economic benefits. I think, though, for the first one around protection of data and the second one around maintaining supply, we have to look at other mechanisms. And those mechanisms exist today. We just may not have used them, for these specific type of threats. So maybe I'll just back up a bit and remind everyone, when we deliver a service or a program in the government of Canada, it typically has a large digital component to it. It's very unusual that we deliver something today that doesn't have technology behind it. And we've become very dependent on technology to get the efficiencies around delivery. Canadians expect that. They want, a digital experience. But that technology requires a global supply chain. If I were to pop open a server or any other piece of equipment, you would see parts from all over the world that are in there to get to that, right? And so I think the main threat that we worry about when we talk about digital sovereignty is that supply chain being used against us as leverage, that somehow it gets misused and we become a victim of that supply chain. So the threats that we look at, again, going back to the protection of data, we have mechanisms today. So we talked about the role of the business owner. Part of what they do is they categorize the data that's being looked at. They apply the appropriate security controls. What's important in that is the risk mitigations are proportional to the risks. And I'll come back to that. For the maintenance of supply, we use business continuity planning today, right? We worry about interruption. And typically, we've always thought about interruption being a tornado, an earthquake. But now we also have to think about the interruption of supply. So we have a business continuity methodology. We can assess the risks around it and apply appropriate mitigations. The reason I talk about proportionality in there is because we have to be careful that we don't try to over mitigate the risks in where we introduce new risks. And what I mean by that is often to get increased sovereignty mitigations, we have to give up something else. Either we're shrinking the size of market that's available, or we're introducing new costs. And so the mitigations, going back to the protection of data, that could be things like encryption that's solely under our control. That could be mechanisms like confidential computing. In the terms of the business continuity, we may choose to stockpile goods so that we have a strategic reserve. We may want to diversify our suppliers. So diversification, of course, is important. And in case of services, we're quite sensitive to a lot of online services. We've moved to as a service model in IT. So cloud computing has become quite big. And so we have concerns there around interruption as well. And so that might mean in some cases, we may reduce commercial entities' role in delivering those services. And for an example, we do that today in our secret fabric in our secret network, right? The government those services are under the control of the government of Canada. Yes, we use foreign supply servers and software, but the operations are under our control, right? But that has trade-offs to it. If you are a user of the secret network, you realize that you get a very different user experience than the one that you have on your day-to-day usage, right? It looks like a 20-year-old technology experience. It moves at a different pace. It has lower functionality. So again, The Canadian supplier helps us from an economic point of view. For those two other objectives, we have to turn to security assessments, and we have to turn to business continuity planning, and we have to make sure the mitigations that we apply are proportional to the risks, because mitigations have trade-offs. Often we can't get it all. There are no zero risk scenarios, so it's important for business owners to trade off those mitigations and risks.
Thanks, Scott. Super interesting. I have more questions, but I'll move to Barb for now. Barb, last question of this theme goes to you. Pouvez-vous donner un aperçu du programme Solutions Innovatrices Canada et des raisons pour lesquelles il est considéré comme un vecteur clé de l'exécution de la politique? Comment les ministères peuvent-ils en tirer parti pour atteindre leurs propres objectifs dans le cadre de la politique?
Merci, Joël. Comme j'ai dit, le programme Solutions Innovatrices Canada vise à aider les ministères à adopter plus rapidement des solutions canadiennes et augmenter les possibilités d'approvisionnement pour l'industrie canadienne. Aussi, nous renforçons les secteurs technologiques du Canada et la résilience économique du pays. Le programme met en relation les ministères avec des innovations conçues au Canada, ce qui nous place dans une position unique pour appuyer les ministères dans la mise en œuvre de la politique de l'achat canadienne. And then the second part of your question, you asked about how departments can leverage the program. So there's a few ways we can do this. To start with, and maybe the most straightforward, is that Innovative Solutions Canada has a strong and growing pipeline of qualified Canadian technologies that are available for testing now, and also with technologies available for commercial procurement. We have over 60 commercially ready innovations that are uniquely Canadian that are available for procurement and adoption under our pathway to commercialization. And these include quantum technologies, AI technologies. We have AI-driven platform that helps inspect federal assets. We have data analytics platforms, speech translation tools, and portable intelligence systems, among many other technologies. We also work with departments. So as I noted earlier, if you have an area where you know you'll need a technology and you're looking for a Canadian solution, we can work with you to develop a solution-based call to go out to Canadian companies to support the development and then prototype testing of these technologies. So we can work with you to address your needs. We can provide through our team and in collaboration with our partners over at PSPC and Ron's team, we can provide assistance through the program and how to leverage it to meet your mandate needs. And as I noted, we can connect you to innovations that are already in our roster that have been tested and that are available for additional tests if you're looking for a Canadian solution. So there's a number of ways you can reach out to us, and we'll be happy to follow up and see what we can do.
Thanks very much, Barb. Folks, I'm going to move quickly to the fourth theme. Cognizant of time here, I want to leave some time for questions. So just a note to our panelists to try and keep the remaining responses brief so that we can move to Q&As. Ron, I'm going to pose the first question to you in this theme. So this is about risk, results, and sort of the larger global context. We've seen amendments recently to the CITT procurement inquiry regulations. What are these, and how do these support the Buy Canadian objectives?
Yeah, so thanks for that, Joel. I think the Canadian International Trade Tribunal, for those that maybe don't know the CITT, they are a body that forms part of Canada's, I'll say, recourse mechanism landscape against the obligations that Canada has to its trade partners in the international order when it comes to entering into bilateral and mutually binding trade agreements with various countries around the world. CITT, in effect, is a body where suppliers can go and can allege that there's been an unfair trade practice that has disadvantaged them in a procurement in many cases. The CITT body, if they should decide to hear a complaint, because they don't necessarily hear every complaint that they receive, there's a process where both Canada and that supplier make representations to that body. It's quasi-judicial in nature, and the results of that that look at a particular complaint and the adjudication of it are binding on the government of Canada. So, in that sense, it's very judicial-like. It is a venue that most procurement officers and contracting authorities around government pay close attention to, because it's the avenue of first recourse if we do something that suppliers feel is unfair, and it can absolutely have repercussions on procurement services that we deliver to our clients in making sure that we can give them a contract that will withstand that scrutiny. When it comes to the CITT, basically it is governed by a series of regulations, and they are the CITT procurement inquiry regulations, as you mentioned. And they were recently changed, I think in November was the time frame. So those changes, although the policy suite around Buy Canadian was released after those changes, I'll say the consideration or contemplation of the changes of the CITT regulations foresaw the Buy Canadian policy. They were part of that modernization package that went into the regulatory changes. And because of that, the government thought to include in the new CITT regulations to include a blanket exception for the Buy Canadian policy. So in other words, if a supplier were to make a complaint based around the application of or invocation of the Buy Canadian policy, CITT is not a body that can hear the complaint on that basis. Suppliers can make a complaint to the CITT about any number of issues on a procurement where the Buy Canadian policy applies, but not specifically on the application of the policy itself or that procurement falls under the policy. So what that would mean is, for example, they would not hear a complaint. They would not agree to hear a complaint or accept that as a recourse avenue for measures that restrict participation to Canadian suppliers or that favor Canadian suppliers. They wouldn't be able to complain that the requirements that supplied goods or services must be Canadian, or that they favor Canadian goods or services. They can't hear a complaint on the basis that requirements favor the use of Canadian materials or Canadian subcontractors. They will not hear complaints that bids must provide benefit for Canada or contain a minimum Canadian value added, or favor bids based on these factors. And they can't hear a complaint based on restrictions that limit participation to small businesses. They also can't challenge definitions. So the definitions in the policy suite for Canadian supplier, Canadian good, Canadian material, subcontractor, benefit the Canadian, Canadian value added, and so on. These are not reviewable by the CITT because of the regulatory changes. So it prevents, in effect, suppliers from using the complaint process to attack Canadian preference rules, and ensures that procurement officers can apply the policy without the risk of CITT reversing that decision or reversing an aspect of the procurement that has to do with the calling up of that specific policy. It's important to note, though, it doesn't exempt the procurement from CITT oversight. So on aspects of that procurement that are challengeable, that don't necessarily relate to the Buy Canadian policy, might relate to something else, like the basis of selection or how a bid evaluation was conducted or something of that nature. They can still be brought to the CITT. It's just specifically taking off the table that the nature and basis of that complaint would be that the Canadian Buy Canadian policy and all its kind of subcomponents were added and applied to that procurement.
Thank you, Ron. Barb, last question of this theme to you. How will we know if the policy is working? What specific metrics are being tracked?
I think for this one, I'll take a little bit of a step backwards. clearly across all the Buy Canadian work, the key metric will be whether Canadian companies, including SMEs, are getting contracts with the government. I think, though, this is about more than that, right? Like, putting on my ISED hat, we're doing this because we want to support the Canadian ecosystem. We want Canadian companies to be growing and scaling. And we know that one of the key levers to help Canadian companies grow is to give them access to federal government contracts. So, maybe if I look at it in terms of how our program reviews, when we are working with Canadian companies, we look, for example, at whether they are getting follow-on contracts. We look at whether they are commercializing their products, because we do work in the R&D space, whether it's creating Canadian IP. And we look at whether they're growing their markets, whether they're creating jobs, whether they are generating additional revenue. And then also fundamentally, whether they're able to expand into export markets. So I think kind of this suite of, how we've traditionally looked at innovation programming will be, kind of the bigger and underlying factors of success beyond, the initial measures of, are we getting contracts into these Canadian companies? But definitely that just measuring the contracts will be a really important step to be monitoring, and to look at whether we are seeing success in the Buy Canadian policy overall. And then, from a departmental perspective, it'll be whether, as Canadian public servants, we're able to meet our needs by accessing Canadian suppliers, and whether we're able to deliver our mandates using homegrown technologies.
Thanks, Barb. With that, I'm going to pose one final question, the same question to each panelist, and then we'll move to the Q&A portion of the event. So we'll maybe follow the same order that we did to introduce ourselves. Ron, I believe we started with you. So the question is, given this has been a lot of information to digest, what is one key takeaway you want the audience to remember from this session with respect to implementation of the Buy Canadian policy from your perspectives?
Yeah,
Ron, you, please.
thanks, Joel. I appreciate the opportunity to go first. So I think if I was to highlight anything, I would say that the key to successful Buy Canadian implementation is going to be early planning and close collaboration between your business owners and your contracting authorities. That's a partnership that's going to be so key in making this a successful endeavor. It can't be added on later by one party or the other as an afterthought. It has to be built into the strategy from the start, and early choices around things like requirements, industry engagement, evaluation design. These are going to determine whether Canadian suppliers can meaningfully participate. If you plan early, the policy, I get that it's a hill to climb to adopt new things and navigate that change management. But if you plan for it early, it becomes more natural and a lot less difficult if all the stakeholders kind of share the same vision and are working on it from the onset. So maybe I would, I'll pass to my colleagues now, since you allowed me to pick the low-hanging fruit.
Thank you. It's a good message. It's a good takeaway. Barb, to you.
I mean, I think building off of what Ron said, I think that, as you're doing your planning, one area I would encourage people to keep in mind is, check in with Innovative Solutions Canada. We might even have a Canadian technology, a Canadian company, already tested that you can, leverage the program and move with, sometimes fairly quickly as well, if we already have it in our lists. So just happy to engage, and looking forward to seeing if we can help some of the departments as they navigate this.
That's a great point, Barb. Thank you. Pat, to you.
Oui, je vais complémenter un peu ce que mes collègues ont dit. Puis, Joël, je sais que tu as demandé un point. J'en aurais peut-être 3, mais je vais être le plus rapide possible. Le premier point, un peu comme Ron a mentionné, l'engagement, pas seulement entre les business owners ou les autorités contractantes, mais aussi entre collègues. On va devoir apprendre de ça collectivement. Donc, la collaboration va super être importante pour la mise en place de cette politique-là. un point que Barb a mentionné dans une autre question, la collecte de données, la collecte d'informations pour savoir si la politique atteint les objectifs va être vraiment aussi importante pour informer l'évolution de la politique. S'il y a besoin d'avoir des ajustements dans le futur, je pense qu'on a besoin de mettre en place ce mécanisme-là de collecte de données, de leçons apprises, puis de s'assurer qu'on atteint les objectifs. Puis, je dirais le troisième point, super important, qui serait plutôt associé à la mission ou la vision de la politique. On a parlé un peu plutôt de complexité, peut-être d'impact sur le temps. Donc, puis c'est facile de voir les défis associés à la politique. Je pense que j'invite tout le monde à regarder la politique d'un autre angle, puis de voir le côté positif de la politique pour le Canada, de mettre ça en place, quelque chose qu'on aurait probablement même dû mettre en place. C'est positif pour l'économie, la collectivité, pour les Canadiens. Donc, si on focus sur cette vision-là, ça va être plus facile pour tout le monde de mettre ça ensemble. Merci, Joël.
Excellent, merci. Scott, last word to you.
Just one thing. Okay, so I guess I'm speaking to the business owners out there, those who are setting the requirement for their procurement, and I maybe a bit of a word of caution. Digital sovereignty is discussed a lot right now, and we see a lot of suppliers in the market who are promoting their sovereign capabilities, and I think it's created kind of a confusion out there as to how best mitigate sovereignty threats. I'd say, question that marketing, be skeptical, no disrespect to our suppliers, fall back on our risk assessment frameworks that we have today for security, for business continuity planning, and make sure that you're doing that in a very rational way, and you're mitigating the risks in a way that are proportional. Your mitigations are proportional to the risks, right? Remember, each requirement that you state has a cost. It has a repercussion in terms of potentially reducing market availability, reducing the feature set that you get. So that balance is important, and rest on those risk assessment and risk mitigation frameworks that we have.
Thank you. Makes me think back to my opening remarks about our procurement folks being defenders of our sovereignty, and I do think that is true to a large extent, and you made the point a little bit there, Scott. That concludes the panel discussion component of our session here, folks. I'm going to move now to the Q&A session. Ron, Pat, I'm going to pose the first question to you as representatives of our common service providers. So feel free to decide how you want to respond or in what order. Le politique entraînera-t-elle une hausse de prix pour le gouvernement? Comment contribue-t-elle au concept d'optimisation des ressources qui ne correspondent pas toujours forcément au prix le plus bas?
Peut-être je peux commencer, Pat, si tu es confortable.
Oui, vas-y, Ron, absolument.
Comme, à mon avis, il est prévu que l'application de la politique puisse entraîner, dans certains cas, une augmentation des prix. Ce risque, selon moi, est inhérent à l'inclusion des critères socio-économiques en général, ou peut-être des critères environnementaux ou des autres affaires de même dans les processus d'approvisionnement. Donc, la notion de meilleure valeur, je voulais dire, s'applique dans ce cas ici. Donc, il exige qu'un approvisionnement atteigne l'équilibre optimal entre les coûts et les résultats, y compris les retombées socio-économiques. Une exemption ou exception de la politique peut être demandée, c'est disponible. S'il est prévu que les coûts augmenteront plus que 25 ou si aucune capacité canadienne n'existe, cela permet d'éviter des hausses de prix excessives, mais de toute façon, je sais qu'il devrait être exceptionnel. Donc, le gouvernement ayant considéré que oui, ça va probablement coûter un petit peu plus. Puis c'était considéré au niveau politique avant que la politique a sorti. Donc, comme mentionné, la notion de meilleure valeur s'applique dans ce cas ici. Donc, je ne sais pas, Pat, si tu as des autres facteurs ou points de vue à ajouter, mais peut-être je vais te laisser.
OK. Merci, Ron. Puis je pense que tu as touché aux points principaux. Peut-être tu rajouterais, comme tu dis, le gouvernement a prévu ça quand on a mis la politique en place. Puis avec le changement qu'on a vécu récemment dans l'environnement géopolitique, on a vu beaucoup de Canadiens qui ont fait le choix de payer un peu plus cher pour encourager l'économie canadienne, que ce soit à l'épicerie ou ailleurs. Puis c'est pas différent pour ça. L'idée, c'est de supporter notre économie qui va avoir des bénéfices à long terme. Donc, le concept de valeur, de meilleure valeur, comme Ron a expliqué, est important. Je dirais peut-être le seul autre point pour essayer d'atténuer ce risque-là le plus possible, d'avoir des coûts plus élevés, c'est de s'assurer que le plus possible on garde un environnement compétitif. Puis c'est pour ça que ces discussions-là entre les autorités techniques, si je peux dire, puis les gens, les autorités contractuelles arrivent tôt. Puis quelque chose à analyser par exemple, est-ce qu'on on peut briser ou séparer les besoins en plusieurs parties? Plus on regroupe les besoins, plus on limite l'environnement compétitif. Puis, je prétends pas qu'on peut faire ça dans tous les cas, mais c'est le genre d'analyse qu'on veut faire pour s'assurer qu'on maintient, en appliquant la politique, un environnement compétitif. Puis, dernier point peut-être, je reviens à mon point au niveau de la collecte des données. Barb en a parlé. Ça va être vraiment important de s'assurer qu'on amasse ces données-là pour être capable, dans un an, par exemple, d'évaluer si oui, on a payé plus cher, ça a été quoi la valeur ajoutée, et ainsi de suite. Donc, je vais arrêter ici.
Merci. Very interesting. Thank you very much. I'm going to move quickly so we can get as many questions in as possible. Scott, this one is for you. TBS's November white paper defined digital sovereignty as the ability of the federal government to exercise autonomy over its digital infrastructure, data, and intellectual property. Can TB, Treasury Board, address the link between sovereignty and data/IP?
Yeah, I think so. So I think, we've seen this trend for a while, but it's really heightened in the era of AI where data is being used to build products, and those products are sold, and there's obviously revenue there and economic growth. And so, we see a lot of people, they go into social media, they click on their favorites, they look at an advertisement, they connect with friends. All of that feeds an algorithm. That algorithm is used for advertising, that creates revenue, and there's huge companies that profit from that, right? Obviously, we can't stop people, in terms of Canadians, in terms of their choices around social media, but we do commit our data to systems, and those systems are quite often operated by our commercial supplier, and increasingly so. So the protection of that data and making sure that that data is under our control and under our rules is critical. We don't want to make sure they're not either inadvertently or specifically reusing our behaviors, our data to create new products and profit off that products. We want to be able to choose some of that, right? So it kind of unites the two objectives between confidentiality of data and economic benefits. We see that data and our human usage is being used to create large enterprises and profits, and we want to make sure those benefits are able to stay in Canada to a degree. So that's really the link that we were trying to achieve around data and intellectual property.
Thanks, Scott. Next question is for you, Pat, and it has I think a bit of a tie in here. Before I ask, I'll just say, folks, feel free to ask questions in the official language of your choice. We'll respond in either. Pat, is the federal government working to move away from American technology companies such as Microsoft, as France has recently done, for sovereignty reasons?
Excellent question. Thanks for whoever asked the question. So I guess I'll go back to something I mentioned before. There is already work ongoing. I was talking about this in the context of planning. There's a lot of work ongoing at Shared Services Canada in collaboration with our colleagues from Treasury Board Secretariat, OCIO, and other key stakeholders within the Government of Canada to diversify. So there's a recognition within the government and at the political level as well that we are too dependent in some cases in foreign vendors. And that's one of the reasons why this policy was put in place. None of this, however, will happen overnight. I think the reference here is Microsoft. The suite that Microsoft is providing right now actually provide a significant number of tools that are integrated. We're supporting somewhere between 500,000 and 600,000 users across the Government of Canada. It's a significant undertaking to move away from something like this. All that to say, though, there is work ongoing to look at these, and Microsoft is one case, but there are a number of other ones. I was referring just in the previous question about something like breaking down the requirement. If we have a suite that currently supports 30, 40, 50 different type of tools, of capabilities, how can we look at ways to break this down into smaller capabilities, and then look also at the impact of doing this on price, on usability, on function, on security. Scott's probably watching me and making sure I don't forget security in that answer. So those are important things. I would add one more element, and maybe one example of what we have been doing on the cloud front. So on the cloud front, we are today mostly working, and I say today, I would even say today, we've already started to diversify on cloud, but used to be very focused and dependent on large US hyperscalers with one cloud vehicles. Well, we're now putting in place a cloud procurement ecosystem where we're looking at segregating the functions to allow exactly this and support Canadian vendors and small and medium Canadian vendors to enter the cloud market and allow them to evolve and develop. We've kicked off a sovereign cloud procurement process that's ongoing, which is focused exactly on Canadian vendors. We have a private cloud initiative as well. So all that to say, the answer is yes, but these things won't happen overnight. It's going to take time.
Merci, Pat. Ron, next question to you. Given the exclusions, like sensitive operations, are determined by the client department based on their specific requirements, how should the contracting authority effectively apply its challenge function in this context?
Yeah, no, thanks, Joel. I think that's an important one to talk about. So this is something that contracting authorities struggle with, not just about this, but about a variety of things when it comes to procurement. We have business owners, or some people, will refer to their partners as technical authorities around government, depending on where you sit and the nomenclature you're using. And their measure of success is program delivery and speed to getting to that program delivery. And contracting authorities work on a daily basis with that community to try and achieve best value, including that through that lens of things like socioeconomic principles and contracts, and weigh that off against delivery. So that part of it is really not new. They encounter this on a regular basis. I would say that there's a few considerations to think about when this comes up. So one of them, and pragmatically, it should not make a difference in theory, but pragmatically it does. Where is the contracting authority? So in many cases, the procurement officer that's serving a given client may not actually be the contracting authority. That might be at Shared Services Canada or PSPC. And that can give a degree of separation and allow for a conversation that of a different nature with the business owner about what the constraints might be in terms of the flexibility that they might have. But in the cases where the contracting authority and the business owner are in the same organization and kind of working towards the same objectives and goals, I guess the guideposts I'd give are, I mean, the policy is really designed that individual departments are going to apply it within the framework of governance within their departments if they're operating within their own authorities. But you need to recognize that there's a lot of scrutiny that's being put on the Buy Canadian objectives, the very publicly announced intentions of the government. And you need to have it front of mind that that scrutiny isn't just from your internal audit team at your department. It's not just from PSPC or Shared Services Canada looking at the policy as a common service provider and kind of a third-party organization. A lot of the scrutiny is going to come from other suppliers and members of the public. So when these things get put in place, whether they're intentionally public or not on the proactive disclosure sites, other suppliers in that industry, word gets around, they will know if you're not applying the policy on something where there's a Canadian supplier that could do it. And they will let you know, and they'll let your deputy know, and they'll let your minister know. We're seeing that already in ongoing procurements where Canadian suppliers are very vocally and actively reaching out and trying to press for access to the types of procurements that fall out of under this policy. And the very last thing you want is a sensitive requirement, as an example, being on the front page of the Globe and Mail because another company has, complained in a public venue, or to, have to go up and brief your minister on why you're not executing the will of cabinet. So if you have to make an exception because of something around the sensitive operations nature or any of the other possible exceptions that are out there to the policy, I would really recommend that those decisions be taken at an appropriately senior level within the department so that if that type of scrutiny lands, there's been a careful consideration of the policy and that those decisions have been made at an appropriately accountable level. And when I say appropriately accountable level, I would say executive, not below that, because that's the kind of scrutiny that's going to come forward if you do something that the public or the industry feels is kind of out of step with the expectations of the government.
Thank you, Ron. And I think just to build off of that, I think a shameless plug for our directive. Like I think some of the things that you outlined there, Ron, are good examples of why it's so important to ensure that, and this is always the case, but it's magnified with Buy Canadian. But we need to be documenting the procurement decisions that we make as we work through a file, and this was certainly part of it. Barb, I'm going to turn to you for the next question. For Canadian suppliers who do not have the capacity or who have not developed the technical innovations to meet our needs, will new government funds and programs be available to help them develop their capacities?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. I think that is, part of exactly why Innovative Solutions Canada exists. As I talked about, we are able to support the development and then the testing of the prototypes. The program, just to maybe give a little more context in it, we use both grants and contracts. So depending on kind of the ultimate outcome of the investment, we have fairly flexible ways that we can support Canadian companies. And of course, we're not alone in the innovation suite of programming. There's the whole range of programs that do exist to support development of Canadian innovations, whether that's programs by the NRC, the Global Innovation Clusters. We have the Strategic Response Fund. So there's a whole suite of innovation and business support programming that can be leveraged where appropriate to help advance these goals. And I think it will really just depend on working to identify what those needs are. For example, in just within ISC, we do have the ability to issue either grants or contracts to support both the concept development and then the further development up to a prototype stage of a new technology if a department identifies that they need it. The program was identified in the last budget for a little bit of additional funding. So we can use, we work basically through a combination of either our own funding within the program or through departments bringing funding to leverage to be able to do the work. So there are some funds available, but obviously that will need some planning and advanced work as well.
Super. Thank you, Barb. Pat, next question to you en français. En ce qui concerne l'acquisition d'infrastructures informatiques, entend donné que le SPC négocie le contrat aux normes de GC, le SPC, veillera-t-il à ce que le fournisseur exerce des activités à valeur ajoutée substantielle au Canada? Cette exigence sera-t-elle inscrite dans les contrats du SPC?
Oui, merci pour la question. C'est une question difficile, c'est pas facile à répondre. Puis je commencerai peut-être par dire, je me rappelle pas si Ron l'a mentionné, mais la politique s'applique principalement aux contrats compétitifs. Puis il y avait une logique en arrière de ça, je vous dirais, parce que normalement, quand on va avec des contrats qui sont non compétitifs, c'est parce que il y a une certaine justification, il y a moins d'options, je vous dirais. Donc, tout ça pour dire la réponse en deux parties. Dans les contrats non compétitifs, puis on le fait régulièrement, même les contrats d'entreprise, on maximise la possibilité d'inclure des besoins pour ajouter de la valeur socio-économique. Donc, on va avoir des discussions avec les vendeurs qu'on négocie sur la capacité de supporter les vendeurs et les communautés autochtones. Évidemment, de plus en plus, on a des discussions avec les vendeurs sur des solutions durables, donc environnementales, des solutions qui sont accessibles par défaut, par exemple, puis de supporter les besoins socio-économiques vont continuer à être un élément important dans nos négociations. Jusqu'à quel point on est capable de forcer durant une négociation des solutions où on utilise de la technologie, des vendeurs canadiens. C'est des choses qui vont devenir un gros défi pour nous. Puis définitivement, ça va devenir une priorité. Je vous dirais, puis évidemment, quand on négocie ces choses-là, c'est dans le contrat, puis on s'assure que c'est implémenté. Je dirais aussi l'autre élément par rapport à cette question-là, les vendeurs avec qui on a des contrats d'entreprise source unique comprennent très bien la situation dans laquelle on est, surtout au niveau de la souveraineté digitale. Puis, on voit énormément de vendeurs de plus en plus développer des stratégies corporatives, rentrer en des partenariats avec des compagnies canadiennes parce qu'ils veulent être compétitifs, se positionner à offrir au Canada des solutions souveraines, des solutions où ils apportent une valeur ajoutée à notre économie. Donc, il y a un peu par le biais de la politique indirectement, on donne des incentives à ces vendeurs-là pour déjà se positionner. Deuxième chose, j'ai parlé aussi de la diversification. Donc, on essaie de plus en plus de s'éloigner de contrats à source unique puis de se positionner pour pouvoir compétitionner. Puis évidemment, au moment où on compétitionne, ben là, les besoins sont évidemment inscrits dans le contrat. Puis, je pense que Ron l'a mentionné, il y a un besoin des autorités contractantes au cours du contrat de s'assurer que on travaille avec nos clients pour que le vendeur livre selon les besoins, puis selon ce que le vendeur s'est commis à livrer pour les besoins économiques autant que d'autres besoins. Donc oui, ça va être inscrit dans le contrat dans ce contexte-là. Je vais arrêter ici, Joël. J'espère que ça répond à la question.
Merci, Pat. Ron, à vous. Existe-t-il des mécanismes de recours pour les fournisseurs qui ne respectent pas le politique ou qui fournissent des fausses attestations concernant des biens ou des services canadiens?
Oui, merci pour la question, Joël. Puis je dirais que oui, il y a des mécanismes de recours qu'on peut utiliser, mais j'aimerais reculer un peu puis parler un peu du dessin des contrats qu'on va sortir. Donc, il vaut la peine, puis on va, selon les expériences qu'on va avoir dans les prochains mois, il y aura des différentes tactiques qui vont être essayées, puis des leçons qui vont être apprises quand ça déroule dans les contrats en réalité. Mais le dessin des contrats au commencement, c'est un endroit où on peut considérer des conséquences financières, par exemple, s'il y a des problématiques avec l'application de la politique. Puis aussi, je dirais que si on voit que ça va arriver dans un contrat où, oui, euh, il y a des fausses attestations ou même si le fournisseur il essaie de livrer le montant de contenu canadien qui était dans le contrat, puis il ne peut pas le faire. La première étape, c'est probablement le dialogue avec votre fournisseur pour savoir c'est pourquoi ils ne peuvent pas livrer. Est-ce qu'il y a des rémédiations, des autres euh, changements dans le contrat qu'on peut considérer pour augmenter le niveau de contenu canadien qui est peut-être livrable sous le contenu du contrat puis des livrables en général. Mais sinon, oui, il y a des autres options qu'on peut regarder, comme par exemple euh, la limite de ce qu'on peut faire, c'est comme de terminer le contrat. Donc, c'est toujours une option si le contenu d'un contrat n'est pas livré, on peut le terminer pour cause. Et dans ce cas-là, il y a la politique de gestion du rendement des fournisseurs qui s'appliquera, puis il y a des conséquences qui sont pas mal dures dans ce cas-là. Ça peut, par exemple, limiter le nombre de contrats que ce fournisseur là, pourra avoir au futur avec le gouvernement. Puis aussi, je dirais que si on a des questions là-dessus, parce que c'est nouveau, probablement, j'avais déjà mentionné cela dans peut-être dans le dialogue au commencement du réunion, mais s'il y a des questions là-dessus, l'équipe de politique à SPAC de Buy Canadian, ils sont aussi disponibles pour donner des avis, puis aussi travailler avec les autorités contractantes et le restant des clients qu'on a autour du gouvernement pour naviguer si ça va avoir lieu. Ce n'est pas nécessairement le cas quand on va terminer les contrats. Il y a des autres mesures qui peuvent peut-être être considérées de cas en cas. Mais oui, si vous avez des questions, n'hésitez pas de contacter l'équipe de politique, puis ils peuvent vous aider. Puis si vous êtes aussi pas d'autorité contractante, contactez votre autorité contractante le moment que vous savez que oui, il y a un problème avec le fournisseur pour les livrables, puis ils peuvent travailler avec vous pour s'assurer que ça soit réglé ou peut-être le cas où il vaut la peine, on peut considérer comme terminé, par exemple.
Merci, Ron. Bonne réponse. Barb, to you next. How can we ensure that we are investing in domestic innovation that hold the greatest value to Canada while avoiding reinventing the wheel by investing in areas we're already too far behind in? I think some subjectivity there with respect to what holds the greatest value to Canada, but over to you.
Yeah, thanks for the question. I mean, I think if I had the complete and perfect answer to that, I would I mean, that would be amazing, right? Like, this is the $1 million question. I think, though, if we look at it in the context of Buy Canadian, part of what we're trying to do is make sure that we're supporting the development of companies in areas that the federal government wants to buy, and maybe other levels of government as well. So I think that you know that we can work and make really good investments to support a strong ecosystem. And those companies, if we want to buy, often, other organizations want to buy, often other governments want to buy. So there are real opportunities for growth and for building domestic industries here, in a way that we can leverage. And, sometimes if we try to get it perfect, and that can prevent us from doing things that are really good. So I think we've got lots of opportunities here, but we also do have the ability to support some real cutting edge innovations. Innovative Solutions Canada, among some of the other innovation programs, we're making real strides in developing a strong quantum industry in Canada, and indeed one that the world is looking at. We're world leaders in many areas, and one of the things that we need to do is be looking at buying from our own companies so that we can support them and help them grow.
Thank you, Barb. Scott, next question to you. This is a data sovereignty question. The US government can potentially access data stored by cloud service providers that are subject to US jurisdiction, even if the data is stored in Canada. I don't remember the name of this act, but I'm sure that you know it, Scott. This undermines Canada's control over its data. How does the Buy Canadian policy address this risk?
Yeah, so this is going to be a bit of a long answer because I want to walk through a bit of the chain of thought around it. And so the first thing I want to say is, by the way, Canada can do the same thing, and so can Germany, and so can France. It may surprise a lot of people, but almost every country has laws that apply extraterritorially. And that's because crimes are extraterritorial. In this digital world, law enforcement needs tools that allows them to investigate crimes. And a lot of those crimes now cross borders and are performed digitally. So courts and laws have now been adopted to apply extraterritorially. So I think that's important. I know we pick on the US a lot and the Cloud Act. And what the Cloud Act basically does is clarify that, hey, US law enforcement, you can apply the subpoena powers and warrant powers extraterritorially. We can do the same in Canada. It's in the CSIS Act. There's also a Brecken decision that it says we recognize virtual presence in Canada. So if you do business over the internet, you fall under Canadian law. Okay. So I think it's important to level the playing field. So when it comes to this question, I'm going to break it up into two parts: jurisdiction and enforceability. So does a company fall under the laws of another country? And the answer is almost always yes, despite the corporate structure of that country, the company, the ownership of that company, where it's located. And that's because courts don't use a decision tree to determine jurisdiction. Often, if, for example, I'm a criminal, I'm in Germany, I use a cloud service that's in Germany, but I commit a crime in Canada, Canadian law enforcement will use laws to come after me the best they can to investigate that crime. Okay, so commercial entities do fall under an overlap of jurisdictions. So the next thing you have to look at is enforceability. What is the ability for a foreign government to enforce their law on an entity? And so what I think you look at there is some countries, because of their massive power and their financial control, can assert a lot of penalties on a commercial company, even if they're not physically located there, right? So if you look at a company, it means they could lose suppliers, they could lose customers, they could lose the ability to transact financially, right? We are a very global world. So sanctions can be applied if a commercial entity decides to disobey or not comply with a law in another country. They will be sanctioned, they'll be fined, and so they would suffer the consequences. So when it comes to determining foreign immunity, I think I see a lot of people say like how Canadian a company is. It's probably the wrong question because the definition, like, and I'm differentiating Canadian supplier from Canadian company here, is how are you define Canadian company? A Canadian company can also be a US company, it can be an EU company, right? Like they're not mutually, like citizenship, it's not one or the other. You can hold many different ones. So what you really want to ask your supplier is, when push comes to shove, are you going to comply with Canadian law or foreign law? And what they're going to do is basically look at the question of how much will it cost me to disobey the laws in one country versus another? And when it comes again to countries that have a lot of control over the supply chain and financial systems, they can assert a lot of penalties on a company. So now it comes to how do you protect against that? Encryption that's under our control is one way of doing it, but recognize then you lose the ability for that company to process that data, which may be an advantage to us. For example, when we use M365, you turn on translation, Microsoft's doing the processing. If we encrypt all that, you lose translation. So there's trade-offs there. The next thing is you may want to say, we don't want a model where we have a commercial entity involved in the service delivery. And again, I talked about the top secret network. The operation of that environment is in control of the government of Canada. We don't use a commercial supplier, unlike in cases of public cloud. So the controls that we put in place for those things could have consequences in terms of augmented cost, in lower business value, security controls, et cetera. So this again gets back to proportionality. So what's the likelihood that a US law enforcement is going to be able to get into a US court and say, we think the government of Canada is committing a crime under US law, and therefore we have the ability to get the court to approve a warrant to access data? The likelihood of that scenario is probably very, very small. So how much time do you want to spend and how much effort do you want to spend and how much are you willing to give up for today for the unlikelihood of that scenario of tomorrow? I think that's where people need to come back and look at proportionality of those things. So I think maybe a very long answer around it. It's a complex topic. I could spend an entire panel just talking about this topic alone. It comes up all the time, but there's my short answer, and hopefully it kind of wove through the thread there of thinking.
Thank you, Scott. Yeah, definitely lots of connections to make. And I'll go back to something that you said earlier, because I think for a lot of folks, like the issue of data sovereignty, we don't see the direct link. But to the point that you made earlier, it's very rare in today's world to have a program, a project that doesn't require an IT component to stand up and run. So the IT considerations in procurement are often front and center. I'm cognizant of time here, folks. We have 6 minutes remaining. I want to give people a chance to have a health break before potential 3 p.m. meeting. So we are going to wrap here. Ron, I'm going to go to you for one last very quick question, just with respect to potential guidance that we might be seeing. Will there be more guidelines, samples, templates for practical application of the Buy Canadian policy that we might see from PSBC in the future?
Yeah, no, thanks, Joel. And I think that's a good one to finish with. So short answer is that the Buy Canadian policy is very new. When it first came out and we caught wind that it was coming out in the operational parts of procurement at PSPC, we understood that it was going to have to apply to procurements that were in flight. So because of that, I've had a variety of teams in my organization. I think the same is probably true of Pat's organization at Shared Services Canada and the other operational procurement parts of PSPC, that we've been in many ways trying to craft appropriate terms and conditions and evaluation criteria to take into account the new policy for those in-flight procurements. And as that's happening, we're learning lessons along the way and trying to share those amongst our teams. I realize that that isn't particularly helpful to somebody that's sitting in a non-PSPC or Shared Services Canada department wondering how they're going to go about this. So what I would say is, as we've come up with these different techniques and tools, we're doing our best to feed those back to the policy center at PSPC, and as well the people that that work in something called the Contract Modernization Initiative. So many of the folks that are on this call might be familiar with CMI. It's a effort to standardize things like terms and conditions for contracts. And it's been rolling out progressively to departments across government to help them standardize and streamline the construction of contracts. So as we end up with examples that are specific to commodities and proven to work in spaces like, let's say, IT or infrastructure and so on, those CMI clauses are going to be updated centrally by PSPC and rolled out to the departments that are part of that initiative, so they'll benefit from that. And when it comes to evaluation criteria, we're feeding examples back to the policy center as well, so that they can give those out in terms of advice. So what I would suggest is, for the next little while, if people are making best efforts to apply this and being innovative, I think there's appetite for that to happen and to continue to happen. It's probably the best way to kind of make a difference in the immediate term. But as we have better examples and as you have successes, I would encourage people to share those with colleagues and also share them back with the Buy Canadian policy team at PSPC. Because the more we can get examples of what's working effectively in a given commodity space, the more we can make that available through the procurement community, be it CAB or through the senior designated official net, so that those are distributed throughout government and people are able to not have to reinvent the wheel each time. I would say there is a lot of room to innovate and create in this space because of how new the policy is and how few procurements have actually gone through fully applying it at this point. But as that normalizes, I think it's incumbent on all of us to kind of share those good examples so that we can all learn from one another and apply it the most effective way possible as quickly as possible.
Thank you, Ron. And just before I let you all go, in the chat, you will have seen a link provided to the Canadian Institute for Procurement and Material Management National Workshop in June 2026. There were a lot of questions that came in during the session here today that we did not get to, a lot of them of a more technical nature, understandable why. I'm going to just note the program for the CIPM National Workshop is not posted yet, but there will be a PSPC-led presentation, panel discussion at that workshop that is much more focused on sort of the technical aspects of implementation of the policy. So watch for that. Encourage you to register and come and listen to that as well. So I will close on that. Lastly, sorry, a big thank you to our panelists and to all of those of you who registered for this session and listened in. There were, I think, just over 2,600 folks who registered. I'm not sure how many showed up to view, but obviously a significant amount of interest in this to thank. So thank you to you all for making this a success. Take care.